You are listening to Talking Star Wars.
Hello, Star Wars fans. I'm Alex,
And I'm Connor.
and welcome to episode 66 of Talking Star Wars, where we are going to do a lore spotlight today on Order 66 itself, the infamous moment where the Grand Army of the Republic turns on the Jedi Order and kills them almost to a man and woman and non-binary Jedi in what is called Operation Nightfall.
Yeah, I think that Order 66 has become, I don't know if memed is the right word, but it's in the popular consciousness. And it's the defining moment of the prequel trilogy. It kind of coincides with the fall of Anakin Skywalker and the rise of Darth Vader and the start of the Dark Times. And I don't know about you, but when I was a burgeoning young Star Wars fan, it's something that kind of fascinated me. I know that all the Jedi are gone, but how exactly did that happen?
Yes, yeah, Order 66 and what we want to do today is one, we want to see how that lore point has been expanded on. First, we simply know that all the Jedi are gone, just killed by the Empire. Then in Revenge of the Sith, we see how that came about with the Order 66, with all the clones turning on the Jedi Knights who were their generals. And then we see the event further expanded in other media as it becomes this linchpin of transition from one era to another, from the late Republic Clone Wars period to the period they now call the Rise of the Empire. If there was a Star Wars history book, this would be end of chapter 7, the later stages of the Clone Wars and the Outer Rim sieges, into chapter 8, the rise of the Empire, the consolidation of Palpatine's rule. So yeah, it's this interesting thing that Star Wars does with a lot of lore points, where it's a throwaway line thrown in as extra world building in one moment, and then that serves as fertile ground to be expanded on. There's a semi-famous fantasy author by the name of Dennis L. McKiernan who referred to such events as red slippers, where they would just drop off onto the page. He would the slipper left behind by Cinderella. So just be left behind as a plot point that could be picked up later and examined in another story told at another time.
Sure.
Also, I believe a reference to Wizard of Oz. Ah, the red slippers, a plot point we forgot about.
hmm What to do with these? Yeah, it's come to define so many characters on both sides of the conflict of Order 66. I don't know if you wanted to do a quick rundown of where else we get to see the action outside of Episode 3.
Order 66 happens when Palpatine, it's a contingency plan that Palpatine had programmed into the clone army long before the Clone Wars even started, because Palpatine was nothing if not a planner.
hmm
So, along with other contingency programming he put into his clone army. But when the Mace Windu and the Jedi Council finally figure out that he is a Sith Lord, after his attempted turning of Anakin does not go entirely according to plan, Palpatine then moves up his timetable. It's about the appropriate time anyway. Grievous had been defeated. He had consolidated his grip on power. He had used the Clone Wars to strip away many of the remaining checks and balances on the Chancellor's power. So he then issues the command, as we see in for the first time in Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Palpatine gives Order 66, and it triggers the embedded chip in all of the clones, who then become slavishly loyal to him and the Empire. And I use the word slavish deliberately. And immediately turn on their Jedi generals and commanders and slaughtered them with... even though the number of survivors has expanded as more media has been reduced, it's still less than 100 from more than 10,000. So
Right.
Palpatine's batting at least 99% here, which, I mean, I think you call it a genocide when you hit above 70 or 80%, depending on the... So this is a successful genocide of an entire order and people. This is Night of Long Knives, purging the Templar Order, but like 99% successful.
And seeing it just from the perspective of Episode 3, we see this pretty widespread act where the Jedi are just left. It's an unsuspected attack. Why would these soldiers who have been fighting alongside us turn? And attack. So all of them are caught off guard. All the ones who, succumb to Order 66 at least. Um, and we see that, you know, shape out in many other ways throughout the uh, different media of Star Wars. I know it's probably not the first depiction, but uh, we see the final leg of the Clone Wars, where we get to see Order 66 from the perspective of Ahsoka, and how her viewpoint about clones is a little bit different than our other Jedi, even our master Jedi Yoda. She's trying to, still make some connection within what's there in the clones in order to salvage them.
It's an interesting dichotomy between how the clones were originally depicted in Episode 3, where it's just seemed at the time that they were simply carrying out orders, and it was like a military order, like sealed orders they'd been provided. But when the Clone Wars happened, we show that the clones become actual characters with personalities, and it would not have made sense for even someone with the absolute devotion to the Republic, like someone like Dogma that we see in the Clone Wars, that they would turn on their Jedi generals so easily. So we do see it. We do see the sealed orders version of this in Legends, in the video game, the original Star Wars Battlefront 2, where
Mm-hmm.
the clones are aware the entire time that they have sealed orders to eventually turn on the Jedi if necessary, and it colors their perception of the Jedi the whole time, and the secret missions that they're going on for Palpatine, hiding from their Jedi generals. So that is the Legends version, is that it was just sealed orders, and that the clones were ultimately loyal only to the Republic and didn't have as much loyalty to the Jedi themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But when the Clone Wars came out, I mean, then it moved into the whole military camaraderie between the generals who risked their lives daily for the clones, and the Jedi's compassion and martial prowess gained the respect of their clone troops. So instead, it examined more the clones less as soldiers following orders and more as enslaved clones with orders literally programmed into their brains. Where
Mm-hmm.
when Order 66 is activated for them, they don't have a choice. They're literally taken over by this biological programming, and most of them lose for a time almost any sense of personality, reverting to sort of this baseline, hardline Imperial loyalist. And they gun down the Jedi that they'd been otherwise respecting and serving almost immediately with no hesitation. Even Rex, who saw Ahsoka as something like a daughter or a sister, could only hold out for less than a second before he attempted to kill her.
Mm-hmm. It makes Order 66 all the more tragic, just because we have, and we see in years of the Clone Wars, that each of the clones have distinct personalities. They are not, the way that their trajectory is set, being enslaved and enforced to, commit these acts of genocide is something that goes against the nature that they've developed over the years of the Clone Wars.
And we see that the Order 66 is a way to bypass the Jedi's precognition and empathy. Whereas if the clones are walking around knowing that they're going to murder all the Jedi, then the Jedi would sense something. But by just flipping a switch in their brains, it bypasses that ability. And so we see this. There's two versions of how Kanan Jarrus and his master Depa Billaba are. Order 66 happens and the clones turn on them.
Mm-hmm.
One was originally shown in the Kanan Jarrus comic. It was then later altered, at least the initial instance in the show The Bad Batch, to have the Bad Batch be involved. But either way, they're in the middle of a successful military action against the Separatists. They're joking, cajoling, bonding with the clones, and then moments later, the clones turn on them and gun down Depa Billaba with Kanan Jarrus barely escaping. And it's
Mm-hmm.
almost the exact same thing with Cal Kestis in Fallen Order. Another depiction of Order 66. We see him high-fiving and fist-bumping and chatting with clones, and then not 2 minutes later, they burst in, attempt to murder him, and successfully kill his master, like in his arms. So,
Oh, traumatizing, tragic. It's not. I mean, if we had these, yeah, if we went with Legends, I could see. It would be dastardly if Palpatine sowed this within the clones from the get-go, and they would have their own disagreements with that, or not, just based off of their programming. That's a world where I could see clone troopers really seamlessly turning into stormtroopers, but I think it's stronger in what we have with canon now, where we have Order 66 almost destroying the clones and their abilities to operate successfully, which brings in a more conscripted army of stormtroopers.
yeah, and for that, to see how the clones are affected long term, Connor, I'm going to recommend that you check out when you have time The Bad Batch. And for any of our listeners, if you want to see how the clone army handles the rise of the Empire for the first 2-3 years into the consolidation of the Empire, The Bad Batch, while following our eponymous Bad Batch, is also a look at how the Empire consolidates power and transitions from a clone army to a conscript stormtrooper army of far greater numbers to manage. Because then the job of the stormtrooper corps is no longer to fight external enemies, but to manage internal imperial repression, which calls for an entirely different skill set and scale.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need
So,
if you have no primary enemies, and they didn't until the Rebel Alliance camp. You don't need high-powered, expensive commando units, or very few of them. You need the ability to drop 3 battalions on a starving planet and force them to give you their food rations at blaster point.
mhm. And you need to take into consideration those battalions and what kind of worlds that they're on and what sort of environments that the Empire has set up for them, which would make joining such a force of stormtroopers seem like a worthwhile option. But duly noted, once I do get caught up with the Bad Batch, I'm sure our lovely listeners will be able to expect a Bad Batch spotlight episode. I'm excited for it. I like the idea of taking these, they look, clones in general just appear, yes, like we are identical, but by characteristics they're not. And then you have the Bad Batch, which are a step even further removed, and they are not even um, kind of associated with their clone brethren. It seems like an interesting dynamic. Yeah, but
Yeah.
back to Order 66. So you've mentioned, and we've mentioned, we've got elements of the Bad Batch, of Jedi Fallen Order, of what we see in Clone Wars. Are we missing any other instances where the Order 66 execution is depicted?
Yep, we have a couple more to look at, and once we're done with that, I do want to circle back, Connor, to talk about how this change in lore between Legends and canon, and get your opinion on that.
Sure.
But we have 2 more examples, just prime examples from recent media to call back to for depiction specifically of the Operation Nightfall portion of Order 66, which was Darth Vader's march at the head of the 501st into the Jedi Temple.
Mm-hmm.
So, which we see in Kenobi from Reva's point of view, where she was left for dead after being stabbed by Anakin Skywalker, or after being and barely managed to escape, and then was recruited by the Inquisitorius, who may or may not have known her secret traumatic backstory the entire time, but then pretended not to know, so that to further fuel her attempt to hunt down Jedi. It's like they don't care. She was a weapon to be wielded and then discarded. And we also see Operation Nightfall from Grogu's perspective during Mandalorian Season 3, where he was spirited away from the Jedi Temple as the 501st were storming through the temple and slaughtering everyone that they saw. It was actually an Alderaanian transport that got Grogu off of the planet.
With the help of one Kelleran Beck, none other than Ahmed Best of Jar Jar Binks' acclaim.
Yeah, who is now Kelleran Beck, now a badass dual-wielding Jedi who gave his life to, well, we don't see him die, but we assume he did not survive, but who devoted everything he could to helping one Jedi youngling escape as he could.
Right.
And
very valuable one. Yeah.
Grogu obviously feels very guilty about this, written in the way he recalled the event mentally.
Mm-hmm.
So I think
Yeah.
that is the only other. You get mentions of Order 66 in Rebels, but it's not really dwelt on. Kanan just mentions it, but it's really depicted in either the Bad Batch or the Kanan Jarrus comic. And you can just
Hmm.
pick and mix and match. David Filoni doesn't like it when other people play with his toys, so he always goes out of his way to like, no, I would have done it this way. And he's
Hmm.
like, well, Filoni, we're going to pick and choose which one we actually think is better. You don't have to be salty that other people get to play with your characters.
Right.
Um,
It's the Star Wars is all about tales being told around a campfire. So there's bound to be some uh, differences in each recollection. Um, one story piece, we do get to see a little bit of Order 66 from the perspective of Barra Sophie in Tales of the Empire, where she sees the temple on fire and feels the defeat of the Jedi in one fell swoop. And it's kind of the impetus of her initially joining the Inquisitors.
Yes, where she was not immediately executed for that reason. Oh, and then there are a couple of books that delve into Order 66. The
Oh,
probably
sure.
the relevant of which is The Rise of the Red Blade, which is about a Jedi Knight who had been reprimanded for her passions and her sort of was on probation for some decisions she'd made that had gotten some people killed. She'd taken the quick and easy way. It was just an example of how war generally stripped the Jedi of many of the defenses and coping mechanisms they otherwise would have used to help their members not fall to the dark side or not be vulnerable, and how then the Inquisitorius program exploited those weaknesses. Barra Sophie, as we saw in Tales of the Jedi, eventually rejected that, or Tales of the Empire eventually rejected that, but 13th Sister in The Rise of the Red Blade did not. And
Hmm.
so the whole book is about her going. The first third is her, or first half even is her as a Jedi, and then the second half is her as an Inquisitor. Before, and this is you from reading the book, there had already been media release showing that she was murdered by Darth Vader. So it's a tragedy from start to finish, where you see her utterly committing to darkness and committing absolutely heinous deeds as an Inquisitor, just justifying each step of it to herself in a very believable way, in the same way that anyone who buys into a cause can convince themselves that they're right,
Sure.
up until she falls in love, wants to get out of that life, can't because she's trapped, realizes that she's reaping what she's sown, and is murdered by Darth Vader.
Hmm.
So that is another depiction of Order 66, where literally we learn that Palpatine had a list of potential Inquisitorius recruits, such as Barra
Hmm.
Sophie, and that there were certain Jedi that were on a list where if they could be captured alive to then potentially be either tortured or brought into the Inquisitorius program, they were then transported there. And our protagonist from Rise of the Red Blade was on there,
Sure.
as presumably were some of the other Jedi that we see as Inquisitors.
And that might be a good point to transition back to the canonicity of the thing, just because I don't know, when I was younger, I knew there would be some moment, some event that would lead to the fall of the Jedi. I, much like many fans of our generation, I grew up with the VHS tapes. So, the fall of the Jedi was always something very mystical. And Order 66 was, I think, successfully depicted dramatically enough to sort of fill in those gaps in memory. Um,
Yeah, there are certain things that were expanded on. We're like, did we really need to know how Han Solo met Chewbacca? Did we
mhm,
really need to see him win the Millennium Falcon on Game of Sabacc? Maybe
sure.
not. But for other bits of lore, like seeing how the Jedi fell, like how did we go from 10,000 Jedi Knights, from the might and power we see in the High Republic, such an integral part of people's lives, to sort of gone entirely?
Hmm.
Um, I think it was a necessary thing to depict. You don't necessarily, I guess, need to, but I think it was done well. So I think it was because we go from vague mentions of the fall of the Jedi in A New Hope and
Hmm.
The Empire Strikes Back to where there's just a couple of survivors in Obi-Wan and Yoda, to then the initial depiction in Revenge of the Sith, where we see it as this military Knight of Long Knives coup by Palpatine, this purge, to remove anyone who could recognize him as a Sith Lord and contest his takeover of the Republic into the Empire. And then it continues to be expanded on, where yeah, we know it is this brutal event where all the Jedi were killed, but we see both then how it was part of Palpatine's planning for a long period of time. He had a list of candidates for his Inquisitorius program. He had the orders programmed into the clones even before the Clone Wars started. So we
Mhm.
get the perspective from both the victims in that the Jedi, from the average citizens in the Bad Batch, and even there's even a character that talks about living through it as a civilian in the trilogy Alphabet Squadron. The guy's in his 50s, and he's like, and so he was 20-ish when the Order 66 happened, because this is happening after the Battle of Yavin, and he's like,
Mhm.
yes, all the different versions of what happened that were released officially, because he lived on Coruscant at the time. And he was telling a younger Imperial pilot, like, you've only gotten the most recent version. Well, let me tell you the previous two versions about the Jedi. Because at
Sure.
first they were dangerous terrorist subversives that needed to be put down. But then after that sunk in, it's like, well, then we don't want people asking about them. So it actually turns out the Jedi were mostly archaic and not used anyway. And,
Hmm.
people who are older, obviously remember, but the point is not to prevent people from remembering, but making them afraid to speak about it. It's I mean, honestly, it's following the genocide playbook in that you
Hmm.
don't just eliminate the members of a culture, but you eliminate their written records, their traditions, and then forbid people from speaking about them. So it's erasure, not, and it's or a fear. The goal is not to have people believe what you're saying, if they live through it, but to be too afraid to contradict you, and that a younger
Hmm.
generation will eventually be raised, and they might see some artwork or read some things, be like, "Ah, that's just the old Jedi from so long ago," not quite realizing that, yeah, that was like in the lifetime of my grandparents.
But it's you always have the fans who quibble. It's like, oh, it's only been 19 years. How did people forget about the Jedi? Why does Han Solo think that it's all just, kooky superstitions? And one, Han Solo's an idiot. Um, like it's he's clever, but he's not smart. That man. But also just speaking to the Empire and the galaxy at large, uh, you have planets where maybe the Jedi and Force traditions just don't touch. Um, there's not a burgeoning Jedi populace or community on Tatooine when Qui-Gon Jinn shows up. Um, from Anakin, we just hear stories about the Jedi and looking up to them. So, of course, when we have the systematic wiping out of the Jedi with, um, that action, we have the political machine following closely behind, making sure that any stories of them are pivoted in a way that benefits the Empire.
Yeah, so I think it takes an event that's obviously inspired by some historical purges that have occurred, the Stalinist purges or the Naziist purges. I mean, you look at any fascist regime, and then you can point to at least 1 to 7 purges that they committed, and that's definitely the Empire's the same. And so it's placing that sort of in an understandable human context where, okay, how would this actually happen? What are the mechanics of the Empire committing genocide? And they did, and not more than just the Jedi, but the Jedi are the first example, some of the only people that had the power to actually fight back.
Mhm.
So I know some fans are not a fan of the, like, putting the chip in the clones' heads. They preferred the sealed orders version that we saw in the Legends canon from Battlefront 2 and onwards before the Disney reboot. But I think it was when they then started making clones actual characters we cared about in the Clone Wars, it did not match their characterization. That Commander Cody, who would put his life on the line for Obi-Wan Kenobi, would then without hesitation just blast him. We would have seen more Jedi being tipped off. I mean, maybe you get some of them, but you're not getting the 99% success rate that Palpatine wants.
Right.
So if the clones have bonded with their Jedi, and Jedi are very good at forming empathic connections. I mean, maybe Ki-Adi-Mundi and Pong Krell aside, mostly we see Jedi forming very close bonds with their clone commanders. Depa
Mhm.
Billaba, Plo Koon, Anakin Skywalker is probably the greatest example, but many others
Mhm.
formed very close relationships with their clone troopers. Even Kit Fisto, very close with his clone troopers. They have identities. They like paint their starfighters. Plo Koon's squadron is called the Wolf Pack, and we
Mhm.
literally see the Wolf Pack shoot him down without hesitation in
Right.
Revenge of the Sith. So I think the chip aspect is kind of conditioning, like Manchurian Candidate style mental conditioning
Mhm.
was a required plot point if you're going to have both of those things coexist. And I'm fine with it as a piece of canon because then it drives home Palpatine's literal using people as tools in a very literal sense,
Mhm.
but also in his planning, but also drives home that when you take a step back and look, the clones were slave soldiers, and it's an uncomfortable truth that the Jedi didn't really have time to address. Padme was trying to pass clone personhood laws, meaning the clones
Mhm.
technically didn't have the right to make their own decisions. So the whole thing is horrifying, and it's sort of glossed over, kind of in the same way that like droid slavery is glossed over. But
Right.
then I think this new version of Order 66 directly grapples with, they didn't have much agency, and then what agency they did is entirely taken away as they're forced to
Mhm.
kill their closest allies and become simply another tool of the Empire.
And then become forced to just, deal with that afterwards, which uh, I know there's some inkling that that happens in the Bad Batch, and again, I'm looking forward to seeing it firsthand. But yeah, I think it also speaks to where, just again, with the, oh, how do people forget about the Jedi after 20 years? Just seeing the just what a shock it is for the Jedi that this happens based off of the several seasons of the Clone Wars that we get where they build those relationships where it's almost you know it's too bad that show didn't come out in between episodes 2 and 3 so that people could see that and learn that, but that's not quite the way how media works. And even moving forward, you will have people who watch the Clone Wars before they watch episode 3 or before they watch any Star Wars, just because it's kind of how the media is geared. But it's
I
this.
know there are people. I know there are people who have made supercuts of the Siege of Mandalore arc from season 7 of the Clone Wars, intercutting all the scenes in chronological order with the Revenge of the Sith.
Mhm. It's a beautiful way in which Star Wars fans can take this media, no matter when it's released, how it's released, and absorb the story still in full. It's a beautiful way in which Star Wars can continue to look forward and backward. It's not like Marvel where you make one prequel in the Black Widow and then it is the start of a sinking ship. Uh, Star Wars has always been very fluid when it comes to storytelling, and it's just based on what is going to be the most interesting, entertaining, moving story, no matter what period it's set in. Uh, and by and large, other than some Kanan Jarrus discrepancies, they've done a great job in maintaining continuity.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of other franchises to compare it to, so I
Mhm.
don't think there's anyone that has perfect continuity.
Yeah.
But I mean, with the multimedia franchise with thousands of people contributing to it, I mean, the fact that it mostly all hangs together decently well is a success by itself. Now, if Dave Filoni could just resist the urge to contradict anyone, he seems to a little bit go out of his way to someone else wrote something for Ahsoka. No, 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 no.
Hmm.
I need to then overwrite that for my own thing for Ahsoka.
This is what really happened. Yeah.
Dave, come on. No one is questioning the fact that you were one of the primary creators of Ahsoka. Just chill.
Hmm. Right.
The Ahsoka book was good. You could let it be canon. But and I think that just one of the last subjects we want to talk about today is we talked about Order 66 and how it's evolved as part of canon, but how this also serves as an example of a type of storytelling that Star Wars does for its world building in general, which is taking a simple mention, one of those red slippers I talked about, and then making it into a whole plot point in the future.
Hmm.
Sometimes successfully, sometimes not, but it does make the world feel lived in. And unless of a sometimes it's sort of in a fan service way, but sometimes it's just in a we can expand on that. So the Clone Wars was originally just one line from Luke in A New Hope, and it became
Hmm.
an entire plot point across 2 other movies, a 7 season show, and the aftermath of which became another 3 season show.
Hmm.
So, off of one line from Luke saying, "Oh, you fought with my father in the Clone Wars," and then Leia also saying, "You served with my father in the Clone Wars." So from those simple mentions, we then get the whole backstory filled in. And there are other examples where Star Wars does this as well, from the simple character interactions to, we have Han mentioning doing the castle run in 12 parsecs. And what are some other, and we have Order 66 being the fall of the Jedi. What are some other of these areas where a simple mention is being expanded on significantly?
I don't know if this fits with a single mention, but we see just so much of the training that Luke does with Yoda be reflected in the prequels, where the school of Jedi is very much school. It's structured, and with Luke, it's a little bit more loose. It's a little bit more um, just open. But even without looking at single mentions of lines, we can take a look at Boba Fett, who is everybody's favorite toy, and then, you know, decades later, turn that character into an entire culture, uh, a varying culture. It's one of my favorite parts of Mandalorian, especially in season 3, where we get to see 3 different factions of Mandalorians come together and unite. Uh, it's taking just simple designs and ideas and finding the people who are passionate about them and letting them expand.
Yeah, I think we have lots of examples on that too. I mean, the show Andor itself is arising from one character from
Hmm.
a side movie that's like, how did he become this drenched in blood rebel operative, um, who is one small step above Saw Gerrera, maybe. And we made a whole show about it. It's one of the most compelling Star Wars we've ever done. And then
Hmm.
we also get things like, oh, how did we steal the Death Star plans? Because we know that they were beamed aboard Leia's ship. Well, that's what Rogue One, we had made a whole movie to explore how the plans
Hmm.
got there. And it's, again, one of the best Star Wars movies.
Right.
Um, we, it's like, oh, how did, oh, Kylo Ren and Ben Solo ends up becoming Kylo Ren. How did that happen? Well, we have this comic, The Rise of Kylo Ren. Would you like to know more?
Hmm.
So we have books and ancillary media that often will expand on that, but sometimes like a throwaway line in main media will then spawn this whole other series. We have Obi-Wan in one scene with Qui-Gon Jinn mention the trials, and then the trials for a Padawan to become a master are then depicted in a dozen different ways across different
Hmm.
media, from Cal Kestis to Kanan Jarrus to Ahsoka herself, going through different versions of the trials before they consider themselves Jedi.
Hmm. I
We
think the Clone Wars series does a fantastic job of this, where it's okay. We've got this notion of light side, dark side. Uh, it's pretty simple, right? And not entirely. I mean, they expand on different Night Sisters, which are born out of different concept art. Um, we have the father, son, and daughter, which is a refreshing, almost religious look at the Force. We've got the Bendu and Rebels, who is a fantastic alien creature where, before it's always been size matters not, but, what do we do when we have this very impressive, imposing Force user who's not exactly on our side? So yeah, it's I think what keeps Star Wars being engaging and relevant, because it's able to develop and change with the times. The political landscape in the original trilogy is very different than the political landscape in the prequel trilogy. So uh, there's just so much room for expansion, room for exploration in the different elements that we uh, have doled to us sometimes for just uh, world building, color reasons. Who knows
Yes.
if
So,
George Lucas knew what the Clone Wars were to be when he made that single mention
oh,
of them.
he had no idea, but that's what
Mhm.
most writers do. And maybe he had
Yeah.
a notion, I suppose. But I mean, there were literally books before he clarified what the Clone Wars were that were like that depicted the clones as the enemies of the Old Republic, because Episode 2 hadn't come out yet, so they had no
Mhm.
idea the clones were on their side. And of course, those books are not canon in either Legends or the current continuity, but
Mhm.
they existed and were made because it was just a throwaway line, and other people wanted to expand on it. And nowadays, of course, there's someone whose job, I believe Pablo Hidalgo, his job is just to try to keep everyone mostly writing in the same canon and saying,
Right.
Dave, please, Filoni, Mr. Filoni, please don't contradict canon again. Dave is like, you see my new title.
No. Yeah. But yeah. Uh,
I bet Pablo and Dave Filoni are friends. So if you
I,
ever
I
listen to
imagine
this,
so.
I imagine there's lots of creative decisions that go into all of these. But
Mhm.
and Dave Filoni, I love your work. Just stop contradicting other people's canon, please. Okay, moving on.
Yes. It's just just keep it all in the same house. But yeah. This is our celebration of Order 66, which, how can you celebrate something so heinous? But I think we found uh, just elements that you know, draw a line back to why Star Wars is so captivating, why it's had such legs with so many generations of fans. It's this continual world building that allows for this ever expanding franchise. So, any other thoughts when it comes to Order 66 or any other orders that might come to mind?
I enjoy that as a well-rounded piece of lore where we see the event from the perspective of its victims, and then from from its perpetrators, and then from the brainwashed people who were forced to carry out the orders, the planning that went into it, the hints of like Sifo Dyas and Tyrannus forming the plans to do it ahead of time, and then how it does make this stark transition from one state of the galaxy to another in a single day. So, and it committed to that and wanted to show in as realistic a fashion as you could how you would achieve such a sea change. And of course, the answer was carefully planned genocide,
Mm-hmm.
as fascists like to do.
I can't think of any other fitting closing than that. It's hard to follow up from genocide, but uh, yeah, I would say yeah, join us next time when we take a look at other dark corners of the galaxy and see what sort of impact they have on Star Wars at large. Um,
Yeah, well, thank you all for listening to this lore spotlight on Order 66 and for sticking around for 66 episodes. So do join us in the future for more Star Wars.
Here's to at least 66 more.
All right.
Execute
Thank you,
Order
Connor.
122. Is that how math works? 132?
I don't know, Connor. We're writers, not mathematicians.
Very
We
fair.
don't
That's
do
not
this.
what I went to school for.
All
I went to
right,
school
thank you
for
all for
art so I could tell you about the colors of Star Wars, but that's an episode for another day.
All right. Well, join us next time for perhaps the colors of Star Wars, and we'll talk to you soon.
Until then. We'll see you sometime soon in a galaxy right here.